Hi, everyone. When commenting on Atlantic piracy, historians habitually use the 1720s as a line of demarcation, signaling an endpoint, a transition from the golden age of piracy to a golden age of privateering. To these historians, this shift reflected the growth of British naval command in the Atlantic world as British officials on land and sea utilized the courts and the Royal Navy to confront, chase, capture, and execute pirates. So in the first decades of the 18th century, according to this view, naval policing was expanded to the Atlantic and Caribbean with demonstrable success in suppressing piracy and turning public opinion against pirates and their commercial and political backers. The Royal Navy functioned as an effective police force, which in the course of a single generation from the late 1690s to the 1720s, transformed the Atlantic from a wild frontier into a more orderly locus of maritime commerce. I haven't found strong evidence to support this thesis. In fact, I've found evidence to reject it. And so what I found, which I offered in the book, is the following. First, marine insurance rates and court records and anecdotal evidence indicate that Atlantic shipping remained at risk from maritime predators well past the 1720s and into the early 19th century, into the 1830s and 40s. And this was the case in both wartime and peace. Second, Britain's command of oceanic trade routes has been overstated, and the intensity of the central government's of Britain's anti-piracy campaign is often also exaggerated. Naval policing, such as it was, took place intermittently, unenthusiastically, and ineffectually at port and in coastal waters, not on the high seas. British officials habitually dealt with piracy not so much as a problem, but as a normal aspect, a fact of life, as a normal aspect of maritime trade, sometimes even as an opportunity for accomplishing private or public goals. And third, the public also remained complicit complicit in and supportive of piratical activity in the 18th century, just as it had been in the 17th, in the golden age of piracy. Okay, so the Atlantic in the 18th and early 19th centuries remained a wild frontier in which armed commerce was the norm, not the exception. So piracy eventually did disappear. In the 1830s and 40s. It was ushered out of the Atlantic indirectly and inadvertently, not through forceful confrontation and suppression at sea, but by changes in the economic makeup of Atlantic trade, which reduced the profitability of contraband trade. Okay. So those are my findings against that more popular theory, but that's not what I will discuss today. What I will do in my remaining time is, one, offer a brief survey of statistical and anecdotal data showing that Atlantic commerce remained violent and predatory well into the 19th century. And two, offer I'll point out that Britain's ineffective anti-piracy campaign reveals not only the limits of British power at sea, but also on land vis-a-vis its constituents. The central government's attempts to extend its jurisdiction beyond coastal waters, to monopolize violence at sea, to sanction some forms of maritime commerce while delegitimizing others, were consistently resisted, ignored, and thwarted by large swaths of English society on both sides of the ocean. And I'll end with a speculation on what leads modern historians to misjudge and overestimate, overstate British control of maritime commerce. So historians who date the passing of Atlantic piracy in the 1720s rely heavily on court cases, official reports, and anti-piracy statutes in Britain and its New World colonies. They see the forcefulness of Lord Bellomont, and, of the governor of New York, and Edward Randolph of the Board of Trade, the actions that they took, the forceful actions that they took against pirates, as well as the enactment of anti-piracy laws by Parliament and by some American assemblies. And they see these as evidence of decisive and effective crime fighting. And so they see they see 1698 to 1701, the years in which those two prominent imperial officials, Bellomont and Randolph, famously exposed, attacked, and prosecuted pirates and their American sponsors and collaborators. They see those years, 1698 to 1701, as a sharp turning point that, again, changed the policy of the British government, initiated this forceful campaign to really combat piracy, and began also not just an effective hunt of pirates, but also the beginning of an effective campaign to change the minds of English constituents to turn against piracy. Okay. But it's evident that this activity, piracy, commerce raiding, etc., did not disappear in the 1720s. First, we know that the Royal Navy was better suited to deterring pirates while escorting commercial convoys, rather than hunting them down. Also, insurance records, and we know this from contemporary accounts of naval officers and commercial accounts that explain that warships were simply not up to the task. They didn't have the necessary traits to be effective as pirate hunters, while they were effective as pirate deterrents. Also, insurance records indicate that risk levels to Atlantic cargoes remained stable in the 17 teens, 20s, and 30s, and onward into the 1820s, for a full century. This indicates, since insurance rates remained stable, it indicates that no sources of risk to shipping were eliminated during the 1720s. This stability in Atlantic rates is all the more noticeable because it bucks an overall trend in maritime in marine insurance of declining premiums during that period. So overall, you see a reduction in rates, but in Atlantic rates, you see stability. Okay. Um, and on top of these two, anecdotal evidence confirms that maritime predation remained a constant feature of Atlantic commerce, again, well into the 19th century. Court records, admiralty records, newspapers, they all chronicle continued piratical attacks through the 1720s, through the 1730s, and on throughout the 18th century on both sides of the Atlantic. The Register of the High Court of Admiralty lists numerous commissions that were issued and transmitted in 1762 and 1772 to colonial capitals from Barbados to Newfoundland, including all the ones in between, for trying pirates in America. Okay? So this was an ongoing activity that was noticed in the metropolitan government, and measures were taken to do something about it. Okay? After the American War, after the American Revolution, we see this reflected in American public life as well. I don't want to use my time by listing anti-piracy legislation and congressional reports and petitions to Congress and piracy trials and accounts in the press on piratical attacks on British and American commerce, but it is evident that piracy still represented a significant risk to shipping and an irksome challenge to governments in Europe and America in the late 18th century, and continued to be so in the 19th century. In 1817, this is almost a century after piracy supposedly died or was killed, suppressed. In 1817, the American consul in St. Thomas, which was a Danish colony, recommended to Secretary of State John Quincy Adams that the US maintain a number of cruisers in the vicinity to protect American shipping from pirate attacks. He pointed out that the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, was already doing exactly that, keeping a few battleships in the area to escort British merchantmen safely into Caribbean harbors, whereas American ships were dissuaded from traveling into some ports in the Caribbean due to fear of pirates. The London Times also, well, I mean, not also, in reference to this practice of protecting ships in the Caribbean, the London Times complained that the Royal Navy wasn't doing enough to suppress pirates in American waters. Okay? And again, I will remind you, this is in the early 19th century. A survey of piracy cases adjudicated in New Orleans federal court reveals the persistence of piracy in the early 19th century, before, during, and especially in the decade after the War of 1812. Okay. During these years, from 1815 to 1823, more than 3,000 acts of Caribbean piracy were recorded in Niles' weekly register. And these data from the New Orleans court corresponds with a broader survey of piracy cases, in which from 1815 to 1823, piracy were among the most numerous and controversial of those decided by the US Supreme Court. So there's plenty of data that shows, it's not hidden, that piracy remained a serious problem for a century past its supposed demise. And like Britain and Spain, the United States government and the United States Navy attempted to control and suppress pirates off its southern coasts and in the West Indies, but it's clear that these efforts were not crowned with success. Official correspondence and congressional reports from the mid-1820s reflect American frustration over these failures. And the persistence of piracy in the early modern era, okay, from the golden age of piracy through to the 19th century, was indicative of a commonly held mindset or legal belief about maritime commerce. Both metropolitan and colonial observers, both European and New World observers in the 18th century, understood the Atlantic as a region in which ship captains were free to engage in forms of violence that were unacceptable in European waters. So in 1700, Governor Beeston of Jamaica informed the Board of Trade that he could not rely on officers of the Royal Navy to tackle the scourge of piracy, since they themselves engaged in armed commerce and believed themselves to be lawless, to be free to conduct in practices that in Europe were considered inappropriate, illegal, illegitimate. So maritime powers saw Europe as a zone of laws, or a zone of governed by law, and the world beyond, this line in the Atlantic, as a place of perpetual war. And it is true that Atlantic commerce took place in a war zone. During the long 18th century, it's from 1688 to 1815, which is a period of constant and recurring imperial global wars between the major empires. During the long 18th century, trade was mostly conducted against the backdrop of these globalized European wars. But even in peacetime, the Atlantic was a place of chronic violence where no single power could expect others to accept its jurisdiction and its territorial claims and its understanding of the law. This sense that the Atlantic was legally distinct from Europe was starting to change in the late 18th century, but this change was evident only in governmental circles in London or in Europe, not in coastal communities farther afield and in America. And at a time in which trading firms enjoyed royal monopolies to trade in certain markets or regions or in certain goods, any sea captain, foreign and domestic, who acted in violation of such a monopoly knew that he faced the prospect of forced seizure and confiscation by the chartered trader or trading company, okay, by the trading company that had monopoly rights over those goods or that territory. So this kind of trade, trading in goods or in a territory that was chartered by some king to a company, to a certain trading company, this kind of trade required ships to travel armed to defend themselves against attack from the legal trader in that market. And it required the legal trader, too, to travel armed to tackle interlopers. Since only ships outfitted to defend themselves could undertake long-distance voyages, merchantmen were equipped for a form of trade that could and did require the use of force. The modern sensibility that war and violence represent a break, a disruption of normal life and politics and commerce, was not shared by early modern Europeans. Okay, this division between war and violence and all the other habits of life is something that we moderns expect, but pre-modern people, early modern people did not. Mercantilist concepts of the global economy called for and reflected commercial competition between states. In wartime, British predation on French, Spanish, and Dutch commerce was effective in denying the enemy the benefits of supplies, etc., while at the same time enriching Britain. But even in times of peace, which, as I said, those times where peacetime were few and far between during that long 18th century. But even in times of peace, plunder was a means to power and advancement in an economic system that was conceptualized as a zero-sum game. Again, this mercantilist economy that they lived in or imagined themselves in. Maritime predation was part of the logic of war, but also part of the logic of commerce, in the words of Brian Mabey, this piracy scholar. Long-distance trade itself was seen as was referred to as a mild form of war, because it was conducted in a war zone and required armed commerce. English custom during, English custom with regard to maritime trade accommodated the practice of violent seizure. And English law, by contrast, English statutory law, increasingly sought to regulate and eventually abolish it. So you had this custom on the one hand that accommodated armed trade and violence at sea, and increasingly English statutory law that sought to restrict it, govern it, and eventually abolish it. Now, our modern accounts of piracy give credence to these early modern statutes and royal proclamations and parliamentary rhetoric, again, trying to restrict and govern and manage and eventually abolish violence at sea. Our histories of piracy give a lot of credence to these, again, proclamations, laws, etc., as reliable reflections of reality on board ships, in port cities, and in local government bureaucracies in the various ports of British trade. And that's a methodological slip-up, okay, to look at these proclamations and statutes and parliamentary rhetoric as a reflection of reality. If we adopted a similar approach to study our own society, you know, in America, in Europe, wherever, then you might conclude that the government has curbed a host of social ills that, in actuality, it has been impotent to control. Okay, if we just went by statutes and rhetoric about underage drinking or gun crime or illegal immigration or drug abuse, we know that that the laws are not a reflection of reality or of the level of offense of criminal activity going on. So the law, as enacted by Parliament and understood by the court, differed from the legal beliefs as well as the informed legal opinion of wide segments of British society. And in a political culture in which law, authority, and jurisdiction were not codified, common practice and common law, rather than statutory law, were the primary guides as to what was legal and what was constitutional. The supremacy of local habit and common law over metropolitan legislation was in fact particularly evident in matters relating to piracy and contraband trade. The distance between the law and between common practice and common law. Piracy also was not usually a full-time vocation. So while some did operate as commerce raiders full-time, other traders and ship captains and crews resorted to it only occasionally when need dictated or opportunity arose. And since, again, most merchantmen were armed, vessels could always turn to raiding. So again, the point is that armed commerce, offensive and defensive, was normal, not exceptional. What was exceptional and novel was the notion, were these proclamations and laws, etc., that reflected this novel idea, contention, that landed governments had the jurisdiction to disallow and delegitimize certain commercial practices at sea, ancient practices with a long pedigree of legitimacy. Okay, so violence at sea was accepted as a normal feature of maritime trade. State regulation at sea was not. It was novel, and it was not seen as legitimate because it was not seen as legal. Okay? It did not adhere to common practice and custom and common law. So, so the question then is why historians accept the dating of piracy's demise in the 1720s. Now, crucial to this dating is the sharp distinction that historians draw between pirates and privateers. Studies that accept this dichotomy tell us that piracy was dead, suppressed by force, and replaced by state-sanctioned, state-regulated, and state-directed privateering. So we moved from the age of piracy to an age of privateering. Yet virtually every modern account of piracy that highlights this distinction between piracy and privateering includes a disclaimer that this distinction was in practical terms a vague and moving target. Most modern scholars acknowledge that it was impossible to keep privateers within the legal bounds of their commissions, and to prevent these crews from broadening their operations into piracy, often mixing privateering and piracy in the same voyage. So this recognition should call into question the entire legalistic distinction articulated in those 18th century government documents between privateering and piracy. Okay, so our historians' recognition that this distinction in practical terms was not really real, and that there was a near 100% overlap between piracy and privateering, and the two were mixed, and privateers conducted operations beyond their commissions, et cetera, it should turn the distinction between privateer and pirate into a purely academic one. Yet many modern scholars, despite that disclaimer, wind up accepting this distinction as a very meaningful and real thing. Contemporaries in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, however, as products of a pre-modern state, intuitively accepted as a practical and ethical reality the smirkiness and the irrelevance of the legal categories created by central governments. These novel categories created by central governments and legislatures. Okay. So whereas state authorization for commerce rating, again, the Privateering Commission, matters a great deal to modern historians, so they can count this is a privateer and this is a pirate. The state authorization was a relatively hollow concept back in the 17th, 18th centuries, because those societies did not recognize that the state had the jurisdiction, the legal authority, and the moral legitimacy to allow or disallow armed commerce. While statutes and edicts articulated the criminality and heinousness of piracy and wrecking and smuggling, English communities all over the, on both sides of the ocean continued to practice these trades and did not consider them illegal, unpatriotic, or even disreputable. This was reflected in everyday practice and therefore also in everyday language. I won't get into it, but I won't get into the common usage of the term privateer, but I'll just ask you to trust me, since my time is short, that the term privateer in the 18th century simply signified a private ship of war and was used interchangeably with pirate, filibuster, buccaneer, freebooter, etc. Not just by sailors, but also by local officials and even imperial officials, occasionally. Occasionally, even imperial officials use these terms inconsistently. In any case, to argue that piracy ended in the 1720s, one has to accept the legal pretense that privateers were a different species of maritime predator, which, as I said, goes against 18th century practice, beliefs, and language. The fact that modern scholars have readily accepted only the legalistic definition of privateering, okay, the parliamentary and court definition, suggests that historians have been, so the fact that our modern scholars, our modern piracy specialists, work within the parliamentary and court definition of pirate and privateer from the 18th and 19th century, suggests that historians have been overexposed to one side of a robust legal, ideological, and cultural contest over the regulation of maritime trade. Okay, so the historians have been exposed to the side, or they work within the rhetoric and the legal beliefs of the side that eventually, in the long run, won that battle. But it did not win that battle in the 18th century. Okay, so our historians are examining the 18th century using rhetoric and legal beliefs that reflected the public's and the government's understanding of commerce, of piracy, of trade, et cetera, in the 20th century. But it's an anachronism. So these historians see this rhetoric and these legal assumptions do not reflect the legal beliefs of 18th century people at sea, at port, and even in courts of law, even in formed legal opinion in the 18th century. So these historians see a swift and revolutionary transformation in public attitudes against piracy and towards the state in that generation, between the 1690s and the 1720s, thanks to the British government's effective legal, naval, and law enforcement campaign, legal campaign, naval, law enforcement, and public relations campaigns. But scholars in other fields of imperial administration point out the practical limits of the central government's ability to enforce laws at a distance on the periphery of the empire. Okay, so you have a general imperial histories that highlight the limits of power and authority and legitimacy of the central government. And yet you have piracy narratives or piracy histories which paint a picture in which the central government had a very effective, super effective capacity to control events on the periphery, at sea and in the periphery, shape public opinion, control local communities, etc. The narrative or the image of the British Empire painted by piracy specialists clashes with the image of the British Empire presented by imperial historians, colonial historians, etc. And from these other histories, from imperial histories, colonial histories, American histories, rather than seeing a change in commercial practices based on policies and ideas and rhetoric coming from Whitehall, from the imperial government, instead, what we see is a persistence of old forms and attitudes in this era of weak central bureaucracies with limited reach, limited resources, limited manpower, and definitely limited legitimacy. And the result was that the ocean persisted as a zone of violence and armed commerce, rather than becoming a trading zone regulated by the British state and policed by the British Navy. And I think that our own experience of the state, of living in very powerful states in which the central government really does have the ability to shape life at a distance, to implement, to enforce the law at great distances, including at sea, and to shape life in vast numbers of community at a very far distance from the central capital. I think that experience that we live in, that our historians live in every day, lead our historians, our piracy specialists, to focus on high politics, statutory law, parliamentary and court discourse, and that leads us to sometimes unwarranted credulity regarding state authority, jurisdiction, power, and competence in the 18th century. Thank you.